All right, so back to capital. So yeah, just quick review before we jumped into everything. Again, here we were talking about the sort of historical evolution into money. All of the reasons that gold was a particularly good commodity to adopt that form of the universal equivalent, that form through which value is understood and which is used to trade commodities and to interpret how much value is within a commodity and is itself a relation that merely expresses in one way or another the sort of social labor that goes into it. And we also had a long discussion on the last stream about some of the disadvantages that gold also has had. And we have obviously stepped into a world where now the gold is not really used as much as the universal equivalent, and we have a dollar form that is not directly tied to gold or silver, even though up until the 70s, 60s, 70s, up until the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, it was theoretically exchangeable. But since then, we've had the emergence of the dollar as a more prevalent universal equivalent, which is something that obviously depends very heavily on the global dominance of the United States, and as mentioned, particularly the sort of interchangeability with debt and the ease with which the dollar can be transitioned into a form in which you're able to get the expected return on capital, because this is going to be much later. This is going to be something that comes up eventually in volume 3, but there is a sort of averaging of the return on capital that makes itself felt throughout the capitalist system, and then plays a very determining role in sort of what then emerges, and what will come up later in discussions around crisis, around the tendency of the rate of profit to decline, and the sort of counter tendencies that can push against that potentially. So yeah, here Marx is going to, as he's starting this out, he's going to assume that gold is the money commodity for the sake of simplicity. Again, this was an easy assumption in his own time, and it's not impossible that it could be an easy assumption in the future, but for our current period, a sort of non-precious metal-based US dollar has taken on the effective role of universal equivalent. So without further ado, let's jump right into chapter 3 on money, or the circulation of commodities. The measure of values. Throughout this work, I assume that gold is the money commodity for the sake of simplicity. The first main function of gold is to supply commodities with the material for the expression of their values, or to represent their values as magnitudes of the same denomination, qualitatively equal and quantitatively comparable. It thus acts as a universal measure of value, and only through performing this function does gold, the specific equivalent commodity, become money. So again, especially this first sentence here is like a longer, complex way to say that, the importance of gold, of money, is that it's playing the role of universal equivalent, that it's this sort of mirror through which you can see the value within any particular commodity, a mirror that is held up to reveal this sort of essence of value that any commodity has. It is not money that renders the commodities commensurable. Quite the contrary, because all commodities as values are objectified human labor, and therefore in themselves commensurable, their values can be communally measured in one and the same specific commodity, and this commodity can be converted into the common measure of their values, that is, into money. Money as a measure of value is the necessary form of appearance of the measure of value which is immanent in commodities, namely labor time. So, again, repeating this, money as a measure of value is the necessary form of appearance of the measure of value which is immanent in commodities, namely labor time. So labor time is the real value underlying this. Money is the necessary tool which is used to decipher that underlying aspect of the socially necessary labor time, which goes into any particular article. Here we have another long footnote by Marx. The question why money does not itself directly represent labor time, so that a piece of paper may represent, for instance, X hours labor, comes down simply to the question why, on the basis of commodity production, the products of labor must take the form of commodities. This is obvious because their taking the form of commodities implies their differentiation into commodities on the one hand and the money commodity on the other. It is also asked why private labor cannot be treated as its opposite, directly social labor. I have elsewhere discussed exhaustively the shallow utopianism of the idea of labor money in a society founded on the production of commodities. On this point, I will only say further that Owen's labor money, for instance, is no more money than a theater ticket is. Owen presupposes directly socialized labor, a form of production diametrically opposed to the production of commodities. The certificate of labor is merely evidence of the part taken by the individual in the common labor, and of his claim to a certain portion of the common product, which has been set aside for consumption. But Owen never made the mistake of presupposing the production of commodities, while at the same time, by juggling with money, trying to circumvent the necessary conditions of that form of production. So yeah, here Marx is kind of an aside of why, there isn't just, labor tokens. Why aren't we just trading with labor tokens? And it is something that is tied to the capitalist mode of production itself, and in being the society driven by the exchange value of commodities, you can't just like pull out labor tokens and as an alternative to sort of make that somehow just or working. And he talks about like Owen presupposes directly socialized labor, a form of production diametrically opposed to the production of commodities. So Owen, who is this famous utopian figure from the early years of utopian socialism, is proposing, a system in which labor has been socialized and is being sort of controlled or directed in one way or another collectively, which is itself, something that then is kind of breaking from commodity production. It's breaking from those kind of capitalist forms. Was Owen presupposing something similar to Marx's labor vouchers in the Gotha Critique, or were those different as well? I'm not entirely sure, because I think here I would have to go into, we would have to read Owen, read Owen a bit to know specifically which proposals Owen has. I feel like we generally read about Owen a lot as like one of these antecedents within utopian socialism, but I don't actually know the specifics of how his system worked. So could be something to note down and explore in the future. The expression of the value of a commodity in gold, X commodity A equals Y money commodity, is its money form or price. I'm going to need a deeper dive here, as you're not sure you follow the finer distinctions between labor certs and money, and why they are fundamentally different, and why we can't have labor certs right now. So let's go through the footnote again carefully. Money as a measure of value is the necessary form of appearance of the measure of value which is immanent in commodities, namely labor time. So the question why money does not itself directly represent labor time, so that a piece of paper may represent ... comes down simply to question why, on the basis of commodity production, the products of labor must take the form of commodities. So Marx's argument here is that you can't have the universal form being labor tokens, because the mode of production is structured around the production of these commodities, of these exchange values, and so it has to be it would have to be something separate and exchangeable. There's also, because Marx isn't really dealing with it at this point, but obviously within this would enter the question of like socially necessary labor time. So if you're in a society that if you're trying to structure it around labor tokens under the capitalist mode of production as it is now, the thing is there's these constant transformations in the productivity of labor in this or that sector, in this or that invention or inversion or new technique, whatever it may be, that is then transforming the socially necessary labor time, so that there's more value in one thing, less value in another. And so that's something that is constantly changing. It's constantly changing from sector to sector, from different commodities, across different articles, different industries. And so you wouldn't be able to arrive at a kind of labor token. A labor token would presume basically a fixed and universal socially necessary labor time. It would also kind of have to presume that everyone is doing labor at the same level of efficiency, or everyone is doing it at exactly the socially necessary labor time average, because that's a concept that of course is built up socially across all of humanity working, or all of humanity that is doing work that then ends up being produced and turned into these exchanged values, into these commodities which are exchanged. And that's something that is kind of socially averaged through the market. But obviously it's not something that is itself equal. It's not the argument of Marx that 1 hour of labor of someone who works very slowly and inefficiently is equal to 1 hour of labor of someone who works very rapid and efficiently and is getting things done much faster. Those two kind of extremes are basically averaged in the marketplace across all of the production that then ties into that marketplace, and the sort of socially necessary labor time is formed as an average of that out of that process of exchange of these different exchange values of these different commodities, of the objects entering into that relationality with each other. So there's like the under capitalism, socially necessary labor time is something that is formed through the exchange of commodities, which means that you can't really take you can't just like take the socially necessary labor time like out of that to put it into a specific token or commodity, because it itself is resolved through the commodities and is changing and exchanging and transforming as part of that. Socially necessary labor time is formed out of that exchange and out of those comparisons. So you can't have it like fixed as a token to exchange. And it also, that's part of why the sort of labor value behind things is concealed under capitalism. Like why the mode of production itself, it's not just like, we reveal that labor is behind everything, and that allows us to see that labor is the value of everything, and so what we're really exchanging is just labor. But it's something that is only revealed through this long, painful process of abstraction that Marx has gone through, understanding what is the commodity form, understanding what is behind the commodity, how does the commodity relate to each other, because it's something again that like it's formed, socially necessary labor time is formed through these objects relating to these other objects. And so, Marx is doing this deep dive into abstraction and dissection to understand what are the social relations underlying behind those object relations that are happening in the marketplace. So yeah, basically, you can't do it because also to understand the labor value behind the things, you have to do all the process that Marx has done in Capital up to this point. And even doing that, it doesn't change the fact that there is this marketplace where the commodities are relating to other commodities, and those relations being formed out and mediated by the market and by each other, like it is through those that the socially necessary labor time is then formed. So you can't just understand, like you can't take it out of that process, since it's something that is the socially necessary labor time is something that is A, constantly changing, and B, revealed through those objects relating to other objects, through those commodities relating to other commodities. So, all of this abstraction has been done to reveal that, labor, yes, underlies all of that. But they still are, these things have to pass through the commodity form to go through those processes where those social averages are determined, essentially. The expression of the value of a commodity in gold, X commodity A equals Y money commodity, is its money form or price. A single equation, such as 1 ton of iron equals 2 ounces of gold, now suffices to express the value of the iron in a socially valid manner. There is no longer any need for this equation to figure as a link in the chain of equations that express the values of all other commodities, because the equivalent commodity, gold, already possesses the character of money. So yeah, here once we have the gold form, or once we have the money price form, we no longer have to do those long previous equations we did of 20 bolts of linen equals 10 bales of hay equals 3 ingots of iron, et cetera, et cetera. You don't have to build it out in that long way, because, well, you're just able to say, okay, it's 2 ounces of gold in this case. The general relative form of value of commodities has therefore resumed its original shape of simple or individual relative value. On the other hand, the expanded relative expression of value, the endless series of equations, has now become the specific relative form of value of the money commodity. So this longer previous equation that we were looking at, that's all contained within money, essentially. However, the endless series itself is now a socially given fact in the shape of the prices of the commodities. We have only to read the quotations of a price list backwards to find the magnitude of the value of money expressed in all sorts of commodities. So again, if you were to, instead of looking, you get a book from the market listing the price of everything. If you, instead of reading, one book equals 5 gold, one sword it costs 10 gold, etc. If you flip that on its head, you see, gold equals X swords equals Y shields equals so much armor, etc. And in that moment, you are returning to that long equation of X equals this drawn out comparison of all the different values to which something is equivalent. However, the endless series itself is now a socially given fact in the shape of the prices of the commodities. We have only to read the quotations of a price list backwards to find the magnitude of the value of money expressed in all sorts of commodities. As against this, money has no price. In order to form a part of this uniform relative form of value of the other commodities, it would have to be brought into relation with itself as its own equivalent. So yeah, here my money has no price. In order to form a part of this uniform relative form of value, it has to be brought into relationship with itself as its own equivalent. So there emerges this problem with money where you're then not understanding it as a commodity itself, because it's taken on this universal role. The price or money form of commodities is, like their form of value generally, quite distinct from their palpable and real bodily form. It is therefore a purely ideal or notional form. Although invisible, the value of iron, linen, and corn exists in these very articles. It is signified through their equality with gold, even though this relation with gold exists only in their heads, so to speak. The guardian of the commodities must therefore lend them his tongue, or hang a ticket on them in order to communicate their prices to the outside world. Here we have a footnote by Marx. Savages and semi-savages use the tongue differently. Captain Perry says of the inhabitants of the west coast of Baffin's Bay, in this case, the case of barter, they licked it, the thing represented to them, twice to their tongues, after which they seemed to consider the bargain satisfactory concluded. In the same way, among the Eastern Eskimo, the exchanger licked each article on receiving it. If the tongue is best used in the north as the organ of appropriation, it is no wonder that in the south the stomach serves as the organ of accumulated property, and that a Kafir estimates the wealth of a man by the size of his belly. The Kafirs know what they are doing, for at the same time as the official British Health Report of 1864 was bemoaning the deficiency of fat-forming substances among a large part of the working class, a certain Dr. Harvey, not however the man who discovered the circulation of blood, was doing well by advertising recipes for reducing the surplus fat of the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy. So long side note by Marx here. We would have to double check some of the anthropological stuff on there's a lot of like the Marx worked with the best sources he had available, but you know, there weren't very good sources on Native American and indigenous economies and relations necessarily to go off of. So some elements do have to be taken carefully and potentially validated with some further research. But this is mostly kind of a side note, more of a proper footnote, as opposed to these longer, some of the footnotes where Marx is basically continuing the main argument of the text. But the key phrase there is the guardian of commodities must therefore lend them his tongue or hang a ticket on them in order to communicate their prices to the outside world. So you have to put a price on something. You have to put a value on your commodity to then be able to take it into the marketplace in one form or another. And that this contains within it, to a certain extent, the value or the ongoing value of all the other things and of ultimately socially necessary labor time, but you know, you need to make this in a way that is readily accessible and exchangeable in the market, and so you put a price on it. Since the expression of the value of commodities in gold is a purely ideal act, and here we have a side note, in other words, it is an act which takes place entirely in the mind and involves no physical transaction. So, yeah, it's saying that you're looking at something. I'm looking at this copy of Capital, and I'm like, yes, this copy of Capital is worth. How much is it worth? Well, it has a price. It has a price right here. It says $20, US $20. I unfortunately had to pay a little bit more for it, I think, because I had to get it down here in Argentina, where it's not always easy to come across English copies of Capital. But yeah, like you are beholding this even without taking it to market, without doing anything, and you're thinking, well, this is worth X. You know, maybe if I take this to a bookstore here, I can sell it even as a used book. Oh, maybe I get like $15 for this as a used book. But it's sitting there in my mind as a potential of this thing, but it hasn't entered into reality yet. Every owner of commodities knows that he is nowhere near turning them into gold when he has given their value the form of a price or of imaginary gold, and that it does not require the tiniest particle of real gold to give a valuation in gold of millions of pounds worth of commodities. So yeah, you're thinking, okay, well, I it's worth this, or maybe I think it's worth this, it should be worth this, but, actually it's not that you have the power to, metamorphosize it into gold, or in this case, in our modern world into dollars. I can't just, tap this and transform it into the $15 or however much it may seem to be worth. There will have to be a whole sort of process that goes into actually making that happening. In its function as measure of value, money therefore serves only in an imaginary or ideal capacity. This circumstance has given rise to the wildest theories. Here he just has a footnote referring to some of his own previous work. But although the money that performs the functions of a measure of value is only imaginary, the price depends entirely on the actual substance that is money. The value, i.e. the quantity of human labor, which is contained in a ton of iron, is expressed by an imaginary quantity of the money commodity which contains the same amount of labor as the iron. Therefore, according to whether it is gold, silver, or copper, which is serving as the measure of value, the value of the ton of iron will be expressed by very different prices, or will be represented by very different quantities of those metals. So when we're thinking about the price of something, we're also obviously not, and I think that this element in the argument Marx is drawing out about not just being, you're not metamorphosizing it into gold, is there to sort of underline this aspect that you're not actually, it's not an active physical transformation of the commodity, or it's not really that it is so much amount of gold or so much amount of silver or so much amount of dollars, whatever it may be. You are using this price form to estimate the socially necessary labor that went into it, that went into transforming it from one thing into another, and that is kind of what you're actually doing when you're attempting to put a price on whatever it may be, or whatever work you did. If therefore two different commodities, such as gold and silver, serve simultaneously as measures of value, all commodities will have two separate price expressions, the price in gold and the price in silver, which will quietly coexist as long as the ratio of the value of silver to that of gold remains unchanged, say at 15:1. However, every alteration in this ratio disturbs the ratio between the gold prices and the silver prices of commodities, and thus proves in fact that a duplication of the measures of values contradicts the function of that measure. And here he has another side note. Wherever silver and gold exist side by side as legal money, i.e. as measures of value, the vain attempt has always been made to treat them as one and the same substance. If one assumes that a given labor time must invariably be objectified in the same proportion in silver and gold, then one assumes, in fact, that gold and silver are the same substance, and that silver, the less valuable metal, represents a constant fraction of gold. From the reign of Edward III to the reign of George II, the history of money in England consists of one long series of perturbations caused by the clash between the legally fixed ratio between the values of gold and silver and the fluctuations in their real values. At one time, gold was too high, at another, silver. The metal that was estimated below its value was withdrawn from circulation, melted down, and exported. The ratio between the two metals was then again altered by law, but the new nominal ratio soon came into conflict in its turn with the real ratio. In our own times, the slight and transient fall in the value of gold compared with silver, which was a consequence of the Indian and Chinese demand for silver, produced on a far more extended scale in France the same phenomena: export of silver and its expulsion from circulation by gold. During the years 1855, 1856, and 1857, the excess in France of gold imports over gold exports amounted to 41,580,000 pounds, while the excess of silver exports over silver imports came to 34,700,000 pounds. In fact, in countries in which both metals are legally measures of value and therefore both legal tender, so that everyone has the option of paying in either metal, the metal that rises in value is at a premium and, like every other commodity, measures its price in the overvalued metal, which alone serves in reality as the measure of value. All the experience of history in this area can be reduced simply to this fact, that where two commodities perform by law the functions of a measure of value, in practice only one maintains that position. So this is a long side note by Marx to basically talk about, for a long time there was this coexistence of both silver and gold, and different different of these absolutist governments attempted to create a clear fixed rate. And in response to that clear fixed rate, there would always be actual market fluctuations in the value of one or the other, which would then make themselves felt by people melting down the one when it was undervalued, selling it abroad, etc. These are sort of the things that come up with, obviously in the absolutist period, the market was expanding significantly, but we were still at a stage where you had to, if you had silver or gold, you had to like literally melt it down and bring it somewhere else. There wasn't a commodities market in the way there is today that sort of instantly resolves many of those things in a constant ongoing market of exchangeability across the world, socially averaging all of that. But these attempts to kind of fix one to another rate ultimately just resulted in, at different times, one or the other being kind of the real measure of value, and being the real basis against which things were fixed, and the other then being under or over that value in a way which encouraged different techniques of getting around it. And this was a constant theme for a lot of the absolutist governments, attempting to control their proper coinage, preventing people from taking pieces of silver off the coinage. That was often something punishable by death or torture of some kind, since it was considered a very serious crime against the state, but was, of course, necessarily done quite often because there was an interest in doing it, obviously. But these were sort of some of the challenges that these early absolutist governments had with their monetary policy. Obviously, now we're at a point of like constant exchangeability and interexchangeability of commodities, that there's a constant commodities market updating the one against the other and traded globally in a way that you're not going to see any physical coinage being melted down or exchanged in that way. And instead, the importance of the coinage is, again, today it's mostly tied to different debt relations or investment relations that those countries have, and then also there are later sort of exchange relations in terms of imports versus exports and other elements. Well, the commodities market has become a proper commodities market, and gold and silver have been one within that, though a sort of privileged one still, since many governments still invest in it as a very secure thing. I think perhaps one of the things to mention here, though, again, is with this discussion of, again, returning to attempts to replace the dollar with like crypto coinage and things like that. What Marx is talking about with gold and silver here can be thought of and sort of reconsidered in light of what happens all the time with the value of Bitcoin. Well, the Bitcoin crowd is really excited that the value of Bitcoin has gone up, or they're really unhappy that the value has gone down. Well, that value is expressed in what? It's expressed in the dollar. They're watching how the one goes up or it goes down in terms of dollars. Same with Ethereum, same with any of the other crypto coins. They're constantly watching the dollar value of it. So it's not, none of those are actually substituting the dollar. It's just they're having their sort of speculative value measured in dollars, which are unchallenged in their status as the firm arbiter of value. And every time a crypto bro is considering, or they're excited about how much their Bitcoin is worth in dollars, well, they're admitting the sort of weakness of Bitcoin in that moment. They're admitting that's not an actual alternative to currency of any kind, because, well, they're not thinking about their Bitcoins in terms of Bitcoin. They're not thinking about their net Bitcoin wealth. They're thinking about the dollars that underline that and how that's gone up or down, since the dollars have and remain the sort of firm marker of wealth, of measuring that sort of socially necessary labor time, measuring that social value. All right, that was a long footnote, so let's find where we were before. Marx loves doing these like full page footnotes, which is probably the biggest contributor to Capital being a scary book are these large footnote asides. All right, so we were at the next page here. Commodities with definite prices all appear in this form. A commodity A equals X gold. B commodity B equals Y gold. C commodity C equals Z gold, etc. Where A, B, C represent definite quantities of the commodities A, B, C, and X, Y, Z definite quantities of gold. So yeah, again, scary math, scary letters, but the important thing is just, again, we're saying like, 20 linen has a price of 5 gold, 10 coats have a price of 5 gold, 20 bushels of corn have a price of 3 gold, whatever it may be. Everything has a different price, which is expressed in some amount of gold in this case, which Marx is taking gold here, but as explained at the beginning of the chapter, it's incidental that gold is being used. It could be anything else. The values of these commodities are therefore changed into imaginary quantities of gold of different magnitudes. Hence, in spite of the confusing variety of the commodities themselves, their values become magnitudes of the same denomination, gold magnitudes. However different each thing is, it then becomes expressed as a certain amount of gold. As such, they are now capable of being compared with each other and measured, and the course of development produces the need to compare them for technical reasons with some fixed quantity of gold as their unit of measurement. This unit, by subsequent division into aliquot parts, becomes itself the standard of measurement. Before they become money, gold, silver, and copper already possess such standards in their weights, so that, for example, a pound, which serves as a unit of measurement, can on the one hand be divided into ounces, and on the other hand be combined with others to make up hundredweights. It is owing to this that in all metallic currencies, the names given to the standards of money or of price were originally taken from the pre-existing names of the standards of weight. So here just talking about, the origin of again, returning to the origin of precious metals, the importance of that was that they were very divisible. And so we have this emergence of money. Initially, you're talking about the different things that were used for measurement that often had their origin in some specific physical weight of silver or of gold, even if they've then become abstracted from that sense then. As measure of value and as standard of price, money performs two quite different functions. It is the measure of value as the social incarnation of human labor. It is the standard of price as a quantity of metal with a fixed weight. As the measure of value, it serves to convert the values of all the manifold commodities into prices, into imaginary quantities of gold. As the standard of price, it measures those quantities of gold. The measure of values measures commodities considered as values. The standard of price measures, on the contrary, quantities of gold by a unit quantity of gold, not the value of one quantity of gold by the weight of another. For the standard of price, a certain weight of gold must be fixed as the unit of measurement. In this case, as in all cases where quantities of the same denomination are to be measured, the stability of the measurement is of decisive importance. Hence, the less the unit of measurement, here quantity of gold, is subject to variation, the better the standard of price fulfills its office. But gold can serve as a measure of value only because it is itself a product of labor, and therefore potentially variable in value. So this is kind of a dense paragraph by Marx here. So it's emphasizing first that basically the dual role of money. It is, as he puts it, the measure of value of social incarnation of human labor, and it is also a specific price set to a specific commodity and set to a certain specific weight, which then allows it to be divided to be compared in an effective way. Within this aspect, it has this aspect of kind of measuring the value of a thing, but also it's taking on that value, but it's able to express that value in a sort of physical, clear form. In this case, of a specific quantity of gold, of a specific quantity of silver, whatever it may be. And in that way, it has the sort of special capacity to give a real form to that value. But since it is, as he finishes off, gold can serve as a measure of value only because it is itself a product of labor and therefore potentially variable in value. So it's only able to do that because it is itself able to measure that certain amount of value and can itself be produced and is a product of that labor. There's a certain amount of work that goes into producing X amount of gold and bringing that to market and refining it, etc. And so because of that, it's able to then represent value in that kind of physical form. And here we have a couple side notes. Peculiar circumstances that while the ounce of gold serves in England as the unit of the standard of money is not divided up into aliquot parts has been explained as follows. Our coinage was originally adapted to the employment of silver only, hence an ounce of silver can always be divided into a certain adequate number of pieces of coin, but as gold was introduced at a later period into a coinage adapted only to silver, an ounce of gold cannot be coined into an aliquot number of pieces. So there he's just mentioning the difficulty. Gold kind of came afterwards in England, and obviously it was difficult to, you can't turn gold into X quantity of silver physically, even if there's a price that may allow that interchangeability. That price is itself going to be, you're just seeing one of those taking on the universal equivalent role, and one of them is dropping away from that universal equivalent form to be expressed in it, to be expressed in the price. And the other notice with English writers, the confusion over measure of value and standard of price. Standard of value is indescribable. Their functions and therefore their names are constantly interchanged. All right, I'm going to grab some more water. So we have a dense chapter here tonight. We're not going to finish this chapter tonight, but it is one of the more denser ones. And it goes for a number of pages. All right. It is, first of all, quite clear that a change in the value of gold in no way impairs its function as a standard of price. No matter how the value of gold varies, different quantities of gold always remain in the same value relation to each other. So that the value of gold may change, the labor that goes into it may change, but it's still going to be a certain amount of, the gold itself is going to be expressed in gold, even as it may change the extent to which it measures socially necessary labor time. If the value of gold fell by 1,000%, 12 ounces of gold would continue to have 12 times the value of 1 ounce of gold. And when we are dealing with prices, we are only concerned with the relation between different quantities of gold. Since, on the other hand, an ounce of gold undergoes no change in weight when its value rises or falls, no change can take place in the weight of its aliquot parts. Thus, gold always renders the same service as a fixed measure of price, however much its value may vary. Moreover, a change in the value of gold does not prevent it from fulfilling its function as measure of value. The change affects all commodities simultaneously, and therefore, other things being equal, leaves the mutual relations between their values unaltered, although those values are now all expressed in higher or lower gold prices than before. So again, basically, even if the value of gold goes down, if suddenly there's a huge gold vein revealed and we're getting a lot more gold comes in, the transformation that's going to take place through this sort of price inflation that happens is ultimately there's going to be a mean of the socially necessary labor time produced eventually. That's going to be around the socially necessary labor time to produce that much gold. So even if a lot of gold comes in, it's still divisible in the same way, it's still interchangeable in the same way, and still has that sort of value as a price. Now, obviously, if things went too far, it would become impractical. If there was as much gold in the world as there is iron, or some other more common material, if there was as much gold as there is carbon or something like that, it would become impractical to use gold because you'd have to have so much of it. So there is a point at which, of course, it would become impractical or worthless in one form or another. But out of dramatic changes like that, I don't know, the arrival of a gold meteorite to Earth that changes the global value of gold forever. It does have that aspect of interchangeability, and even if there is inflation or deflation of one form or another, it's still dividable. It still can be used to express socially necessary labor time, and ultimately its value will be related to that, will be related to the socially necessary labor time to produce it. And so it will eventually kind of mediate this this equalization process to bring prices and to bring the expressed value into line with the expectations of socially necessary labor time. Just as in the case of the estimation of the value of a commodity and the use value of any other commodity, so also in this case, where commodities are valued in gold, we assume nothing more than the production of a given quantity of gold costs, at a given period, a given amount of labor. As regards the fluctuation of commodity prices in general, they are subject to the laws of the simple relative expression of value, which we developed in an earlier chapter. So again, this sort of simple relative expression of value is, again, just sort of saying like, yes, it can change that, now 10 linen equals 2 coats instead of 1 coat, but there is this relation ultimately determined by the labor time going into them, and as that labor time is socially determined. A general rise in the prices of commodities can result either from a rise in their values, which appears when the value of money remains constant, or from a fall in the value of money, which happens when the values of commodities remain constant. The process also occurs in reverse. A general fall in prices can result either from a fall in the values of commodities, if the value of money remains constant, or from a rise in the value of money, if the values of commodities remain constant. It therefore by no means follows that a rise in the value of money necessarily implies a proportional fall in the prices of commodities, or that a fall in the value of money implies a proportional rise in prices. This would hold only for commodities whose value remains constant. But commodities whose value rises simultaneously with and in proportion to that of money would retain the same price. And if their value rose either slower or faster than that of money, the fall or rise in their prices would be determined by the difference between the path described by their value and that described by the value of money, and so on. So here, this is, again, a long and dense paragraph essentially saying, it could be that the price goes up for this reason, but it also, like, there are multiple things going on when prices go up. So it could be that, in the case of gold, there's a huge influx of gold, and so the prices are going up in gold. However, the price may not necessarily go up if there's also a huge influx of something else at the same time. So let's imagine, let's take our imaginary meteorite, which delivers a bunch of gold. Well, it delivers a bunch of gold, but it also delivers a bunch of diamonds. And so we're just very mathematically lucky in a way that it happens to deliver just the amount of diamonds to make it so that the value of diamonds goes up to, it sticks in proportion to gold, essentially. So Marx's is allowing for this possibility when the prices are changing. You know, it could be, yes, it could be that, you know, prices are going up because all that gold has come in and has changed the sort of social value behind each thing. But there could simultaneously be other similar transformations or even the same transformation, the same change, which will affect other commodities and the socially necessary labor time that goes into them. In this case of our example, diamonds, we get a delivery of diamonds from space, which makes them very common. At the same time, gold has been made much more common, and suddenly that value hasn't changed at all. That price hasn't changed at all. Well, the prices have changed for everything else. So it's basically a dense paragraph to explain the possibility of those sort of transformations. And this is going to become important later because we're going to talk about what are the kind of transformations that will be driven by machinery, that will be driven by productivity, that will be driven by transformations in the productive process itself. Let us now go back to considering the price form. For various reasons, the money names of the metal weights are gradually separated from their original weight names, the historically decisive reasons being, one, the introduction of foreign money among less developed peoples. This happened at Rome in its early days, where gold and silver coins circulated at first as foreign commodities. The names of these foreign coins were different from those of the indigenous weights. With the development of material wealth, the more precious metal extrudes, the less precious from its function as measure of value. Silver drives out copper, gold drives out silver, however much the sequence may contradict the chronology of the poets. In any case, its historical validity is not entirely universal. So he's saying that, yes, this happened historically, but it's not necessarily, it wasn't guaranteed. And the more precious drove out the other one, but we could also imagine potentially some other metal that would be so precious that it might actually not be efficient as a means of exchange. If you have a commodity that is so valuable that it is difficult to physically break up, then it is difficult to take on that kind of role that eventually gold took. And there might even be something to look at historically here. For example, England, he talks about England first being silver was expressed more. Well, not a lot of gold is produced in England historically, and so there wasn't a lot of gold to get. So if you're in a situation where a gold coin can buy you a whole tavern or a whole town or whatever it may be, it's going to be hard to use as a means of exchange. There has to be a sort of generalization of there has to have been enough trade and enough exchange to bring in enough gold for to have that kind of baseline to work with before you can use it as a common means of exchange. If it's so valuable that you can't take it with you to market, or you're taking on significant risks doing so, then it's not going to be an efficient means of exchange. Which, again, talking of other things, modern things like one Bitcoin is so valuable that you can't use it for anything. And even worse than precious metals, like a precious metal, part of the advantage is that you can divide it, you can exchange it, and it won't lose value in that exchange. Whereas, if you trade a Bitcoin or a fraction of a Bitcoin or whatever it may be, that actually has costs in the transaction, in the exchange. It costs money, it costs computing power, it costs whatever to actually make that exchange, which then necessarily goes against its potential value or use as some sort of method of exchange. So silver drives out copper, gold drives out silver, however much the sequence may contradict the chronology of the poets. The word pound, for instance, was the money name given to an actual pound weight of silver. As soon as gold had driven out silver as a measure of value, the same name became attached to, say, 1/15 of a pound of gold, depending on the ratio between the values of gold and silver. Pound as a money name and pound as the ordinary weight name of gold are now two different things. Thus, the pound sterling denotes less than 1/3 of its original weight. Pound Scots before the Union only 1/36, the French livre 1/74, the Spanish maravedí less than 1/1000th, and the Portuguese rei a still smaller fraction. Centuries of continuous debasement of the currency by kings and princes have in fact left nothing behind of the original weights of gold coins but their names. The coins which today have a merely ideal denomination are in all nations the oldest. Once upon a time they were all real, and because they were real, people reckoned with them. So yeah, again, talking about this process of the various absolutist monarchies debasing their currency, and often they had this origin as a pound was a pound of this amount, a pound of silver, or whatever it may be, later 1/15th a pound or 1/30th a pound. But they did once have this direct physical connection or physical measurement, which was tied to the physical weight of the silver or gold under discussion. These historical processes have made the separation of the money name from the weight name into a fixed popular custom. Since the standard of money is on the one hand purely conventional, while on the other hand it must possess universal validity, it is in the end regulated by law. A given weight of one of the precious metals, an ounce of gold for instance, becomes officially divided into aliquot parts, baptized by the law as a pound, a thaler, etc. These aliquot parts, which then serve as the actual units of money, are subdivided into other aliquot parts with legal names such as a shilling, a penny, etc. David Oudekart remarks in his familiar words on the monstrosity that nowadays a pound, which is the unit of the English standard of money, is equal to about 1/4 of an ounce of gold. This is falsifying a measure, not establishing a standard. In this false denomination of the weight of gold, he finds what he finds everywhere else, the falsifying hand of civilization. So yeah, just again talking about this process passed through, but these currencies in his own day were still tied in one way or another to silver or gold. It may have been that, it wasn't very much. It was especially at the later point, like a pence would, or a penny would not be equivalent to much of anything in terms of silver. But there still is this sort of theoretical basis exchangeability with this particular metal that sort of underlies the value at that time. But despite this, a definite weight of metal remains the standard of metallic money. All that has changed is the subdivision and the denomination of the money. So again, all these historical processes changing, debasing the currency, just sort of, reset where it was valued in terms of these different precious metals, in terms of its value, but it was still interconnected with that specific value. The prices or quantities of gold into which the values of commodities are ideally changed are therefore now expressed in the money names, or the legally valid names of the subdivisions of the gold standard made for the purpose of reckoning. Hence, instead of saying that 1/4 of wheat is worth an ounce of gold, people in England would say that it's worth 3 pounds and 17s. I'm not sure what 17s is. Would it be pence? I don't think it's pence, but 3 pounds and 17. 10.5d. In this way, commodities express by their money names how much they are worth, and money serves as money of account whenever it is a question of fixing a thing as value, and therefore in its money form. Shillings, yes, that makes sense. Yeah. So 3 pounds, 17 shillings. And yeah, he's just expressing that, now that it's taken on this money form, it is still expressing that it's worth a certain amount of gold or silver or whatever it is that is serving as the universal equivalent. The name of a thing is entirely external to its nature. I know nothing of a man if I merely know his name is Jacob. In the same way, every trace of the money relation disappears in the money names pound, thaler, franc, ducat, etc. The confusion caused by attributing a hidden meaning to these Kabbalistic signs is made even greater by the fact that these money names express both the values of commodities and simultaneously aliquot parts of a certain weight of metal, namely the weight of the metal which serves as the standard of money. Here we have another footnote. Because a standard of price gold is expressed by the same names of account as the prices of commodities, for example, £3 17 sterling, may denote an ounce of gold just as well as a ton of iron. These names of account are called the mint price of gold. Thus, the extraordinary notion arose that gold is estimated in its own material and that, unlike all other commodities, its price is fixed by the state. The establishing of names of account for definite weights of gold was mistaken for the establishing of the value of these weights. So there's a quote from Marx himself, and again, he's just emphasizing that, no, it wasn't the state just arbitrarily establishing this value. There was this interchangeability with gold or silver, which was then evolved into what we see today. And many of these names that different currencies had were tied once to a specific weight measure. They no longer have that. They've become sort of divided from this, but they still represent having a certain base in that. On the other hand, it is in fact necessary that value, as opposed to the multifarious objects of the world of commodities, should develop into this form, a material and non-mental one, but also a simple social form. Here he is, again, quoting himself, theories of the standard of money. Some theorists had fantastic notions of raising or lowering the mint price of money by getting the state to transfer to greater or smaller weights of gold or silver the names already legally appropriated to fixed weights of those metals. So that, for example, a quarter ounce of gold could be minted into 40 shillings in the future instead of 20. However, Petty dealt with these so exhaustively in his Quantulum Cunci concerning money. Where's that word gone from English? We need to bring this word back. Quantulum Cunci. I do not remember having come across this before, but that is one of the words of all time, certainly. Is Quantulum Cunci concerning money to the Lord Marquis of Halifax. Petty, again, was a famous 17th century English political economist who Marx read and drew upon heavily in understanding the sort of evolution of political economy. At least in those cases where they aimed not at clumsy financial operations against public and private creditors, but rather at economic quack remedies, that even his immediate followers, Sir Dudley North and John Locke, not to mention later ones, could only repeat what he said more shallowly. If the wealth of the nation, he remarks, could be decoupled by a proclamation, it were strange that such proclamations have not long since been made by our governors. So yeah, I mean, it just sort of re-emphasizing that even in a time of Petty, it was clear that you can't just, magically create more value to the money out of nowhere, or magically reduce value to the money out of nowhere. That will eventually, express itself through some form of inflation or some form of deflation, depending on the particular change that goes on there. Price is the money name of the labor objectified in a commodity. Yeah, this is an important and clear phrase. So price is the money name of the labor objectified in a commodity. So this is the, again, the actual value is the labor, the socially necessary labor time, which of course is something that fluctuates and changes. But this is underlying the value, and the price is then the name given to that expression in a certain amount of interchangeability with that specific commodity. My cat is requesting to go outside. Here's our culprit. She's complaining. All right. Cats are very bad universal equivalents because they're all very different and, very different. You can't divide them. You can't Can't really interexchange them. Terrible universal equivalent, but very good companions for streams. All right, price is the money name of the labor objectified in a commodity. Hence, the expression of the equivalence of a commodity with the quantity of money whose name is that commodity's price is a tautology. So hence the expression of the equivalence of a commodity with the quantity of money whose name is that commodity's price is a tautology. Here we have a side note, or indeed it must be admitted that 1,000,000 in money is worth more than an equal value in commodities. Hence that one value is worth more than another value which is equal to it. So, okay, so this sentence, hence the expression of the equivalence of a commodity with a quantity of money whose name is that commodity's price, whose name is that commodity's price, is a tautology. So I think this is saying, again, the problem of like expressing a price with a price. Whose name is that commodity's price. The quantity of money whose name is that commodity's price is a tautology. Just as the expression of relative value of a commodity is an expression of the equivalence of two commodities. But although price, being the exponent of the magnitude of a commodity's value, is the exponent of its exchange ratio with money, it does not follow that the exponent of this exchange ratio is necessarily the exponent of the magnitude of the commodity's value. All right, we're getting into difficult parts of this chapter. So let's take our time and work through these. So price being the exponent of the magnitude of a commodity's value, which we've gone through, we've built that up. So price is just an expression of the extent of value of something, is the exponent of its exchange ratio with money. So it's the price is a product of how it can be exchanged with money, which itself is based off of value of a specific commodity. From this, it does not follow that the exponent of this exchange ratio is necessarily the exponent of the magnitude of the commodity's value. So it does not follow that the exponent of this exchange ratio is necessarily the exponent of the magnitude of the commodity's value. Suppose two equal quantities of socially necessary labor are respectively represented by 1/4 of wheat and 2 pounds, approximately half an ounce of gold. 2 pounds is the expression in money of the magnitude of the value of the 1/4 of wheat or its price. If circumstances now allow this price to be raised to 3 pounds or compel it to be reduced to 1 pound, then although 1 pound and 3 pounds may be too small or too large to give proper expression to the magnitude of the wheat's value, they are nevertheless prices of the wheat, for they are, in the first place, the form of its value, i.e. money, and in the second place, the exponents of its exchange ratio of money. If the conditions of production, or the productivity of labor, remain constant, the same amount of social labor time must be expended on the reproduction of 1/4 of wheat, both before and after the change in price. This situation is not dependent either on the will of the wheat producer or on that of the owners of the other commodities. The magnitude of the value of a commodity, therefore, expresses a necessary relation to social labor time, which is inherent in the process by which its value is created. If the transformation of the magnitude of value into the price, this necessary relation appears as the exchange ratio between a single commodity and the money commodity which exists outside it. This relation, however, may express both the magnitude of value of the commodity and the greater or lesser quantity of money for which it can be sold under the given circumstances. The possibility, therefore, of a quantitative incongruity between price and magnitude of value, i.e. the possibility that the price may diverge from the magnitude of value, is inherent in the price form itself. This is not a defect, but on the contrary, it makes this form the adequate one for a mode of production whose laws can only assert themselves as blindly operating averages between constant irregularities. All right, so this is a very important and dense paragraph we're going through here, but essentially we're having this build up to, and I think we can even kind of start with the finale here to help understand it and go through what's being built up to. So this is not a defect, but on the contrary, it makes this form the adequate one for a mode of production whose laws can only assert themselves as blindly operating averages between constant irregularities. So we have this socially necessary labor time underlying the value of everything, underlying the interexchangeability, but this obviously isn't always there in practice. We can see in the capitalist world market today, like, there was a point at which, infamously during the pandemic, in which like oil reached negative values. It had like negative commodity values. You would get paid to take a shipment of oil because it had to still be produced, it had to be delivered and shipped somewhere. You could just stop making it, but the demand had collapsed for that. And so what this paragraph is building up and explaining is that aspect and the importance of that aspect, because there is this separate price form to the commodities. It is not just a pure expression of the socially necessary labor time that goes into it. And so Marx is here, even he's, again, showing that your typical right-wing critic of Marx has never actually read Marx. He's talking about like, yes, it's not that the value in practice, the price in practice corresponds exactly to the socially necessary labor time. That plays as a rule has importance, but it is coming through a sort of anarchic process where these things will also have to be exchanged, traded, where they have to pass through a marketplace. And so there are times when those prices, those values will not correspond. And this is something that is, as he puts it, not a defect, but makes it adequate to understand the capitalist mode of production. It is why having this price form is so important for the capitalist mode of production, because it also allows things to occasionally be above the price of socially necessary labor time, or significantly below the price of socially necessary labor time. It allows for, within the capitalist system, for markets to escape that in its sort of process of anarchic production, in a way that in some cases, may drive towards different productivity. In other cases may have, us famously seeing, let milk poured down the drain in the middle of the Great Depression, as you have people hungry because just the value is below, so we're going to get rid of it, irrelevant to the use value, etc. And so this is kind of the importance of the price form, the importance of price as built up by Marx here, is that price and the sort of separation of the price is what allows this divergence away from socially necessary labor time, which is what is going to be important to markets and what is going to be important to the sort of drives of the capitalist mode of production and to the anarchy of it, in which, yes, there is this average pushing things towards the value of the socially necessary labor time to reduce it, but this is a process that plays out anarchically. It plays out across averages over an entire vast market, and which is constantly transforming and being transformed by advances in productivity or new needs or demands that come up. And so you have things. You may have a particular commodity that had a certain amount of socially necessary labor time that went into producing it, but then its price falls way below that because no one wants it, no one sees a potential use value within it, and that process is essential to the capitalist mode of production. So this paragraph is basically the key in building out this divergence between socially necessary labor time and between how these things operate in practice within the market, within the capitalist mode of production, and the necessity of that divergence for capitalism to be able to function as it does. The price form, however, is not only compatible with the possibility of a quantitative incongruity between magnitude of value and price, i.e. between the magnitude of value and its own expression in money, but it may also harbor a qualitative contradiction, with the result that price ceases altogether to express value, despite the fact that money is nothing but the value form of commodities. Things which in and for themselves are not commodities, things such as conscience, honor, etc., can be offered for sale by the holders, and thus acquire the form of commodities through their price. Hence a thing can, formally speaking, have a price without having a value. The expression of price is in this case imaginary, like certain quantities in mathematics. On the other hand, the imaginary price form may also conceal a real value relation or one derived from it, as for instance the price of uncultivated land, which is without value because no human labor is objectified in it. So yeah, here we have, once we have this price form which allows for this divergence between just the socially necessary labor time that goes into it, then you're able to, it also allows for that price form to be given to things that don't even fit in with that. So he mentions, honor, the plenty of people selling their honor, but it allows for things that are not commodities, that don't necessarily have that, use value or exchange value, aren't tied to labor in a direct way. They can be transformed into commodities. They can be transformed into things that are exchanged, even though there was no social labor that really went into producing them. And so in that way, Marx allows here for things to have a price without having a value, which again, no one who criticizes Marx actually reads Marx. Because the right-wing people, there are very few of them that are going to get through a book like this. They don't read books. They spam racist bullshit on our Twitch chat instead of actually sitting down and reading hard books. So yeah, once this price form is there, you can then convert things that don't fit the commodified production, or things are then able to be turned into commodities even that don't fit the kind of social rules behind it of certain amounts of labor being involved in their production. And returning to that, on the other hand, the imaginary price form may also conceal a real value relation or one derived from it, as for instance the price of uncultivated land, which is without value because no human labor is objectified in it. So again, this price form, yeah, as Veblen's mentioned, like land is a prerequisite for value. Not necessarily just land, but, and as Marx talks about this in other places, like this interaction with nature, it is labor interacting with with something, and labor interacts with nature. And as that nature is a prerequisite to that labor acting upon it, that labor building upon it, you are then able to fit this thing that doesn't, cultivated land has a value despite not having any labor in it, but because the emergence of the price form allows the price to then be put on everything, you're able to put a price on uncultivated land just as you're able to put a price on your honor, on your conscience, whatever it may be. And in that way, you're able to sweep these things that don't really fit the mode of production itself, but you're able to kind of sweep them into this spiral of capitalism. You're able to fit them in as commodities, as price, with their prices, with their exchange value. And obviously, it'll be a whole market process how those values are ultimately determined. But that is something that is made possible by this division between something's price and something's value. And there is a distinction there, and it's one that Marx is making. The value is, the value is based or driven by the socially necessary labor time. The price is as it's actually, brought to market and exchanged. And once you have this separation, with this separation, there's room for, selling your honor, selling your conscience, selling natural land that, that doesn't have any labor involved in actually making it a proper thing. And in that way, from this basis, sort of everything else is then able to be swept into the storm of capitalism, essentially the storm of the commodity form. It's like a hurricane that's kind of bringing all these exterior forms into the center, into this exchange, and into this relation in which then us interacting with only the price form, we're not going to be able to see what is underlying the more fundamental aspects of production, the essential aspects of production in our society. And it appears just as so many prices that we aren't able to dissect or properly understand. Like the relative form of value in general, price expresses the value of a commodity, for instance, a ton of iron, by asserting that a given quantity of the equivalent, for instance, an ounce of gold, is directly exchangeable with iron. But it by no means asserts the converse, that iron is directly exchangeable with gold. In order, therefore, that a commodity may in practice operate effectively as exchange value, it must divest itself of its natural physical body and become transformed from merely imaginary into real gold. Although this act of transubstantiation may be more troublesome for it than the transition from necessity to freedom for the Hegelian concept, the casting of its shell for a lobster, or the putting off of the old Adam for St. Jerome, here's a footnote, if Jerome had to wrestle hard in his youth with the material flesh, as is shown by his fight in the desert with visions of beautiful women, he had also to wrestle in his old age with the spiritual flesh. I thought, he said, I was in the spirit before the judge of the universe. Who art thou? Asked a voice. I am a Christian. Thou liest, thunders back the great judge. Thou art not but a Ciceronian. Not able to provide much more insight on this footnote. Let's stick with the casting of his shell for a lobster. That's kind of the easier one to work with here. But essentially, there has to be this act of transubstantiation, or the possibility of it being exchanged into something else, for there to be that the price lies in its ability to exchange itself for it, and to exchange itself for that precious metal, even if it's not actually done, even if you're not actually doing that transformation in practice. The commodity may, alongside its real shape, iron for instance, possess an ideal value shape or an imagined gold shape in the form of its price. It cannot simultaneously be both real iron and real gold. Again, it has its price, but it's not really that. This price is its ideal, kind of. It's there as something it should be exchanged for, but it won't actually be exchanged for it. It's just something there to sort of set and measure the value, or not the value in this case, but to set and measure as it's being exchanged and as it is expressed in this price form. To establish its price, it is sufficient for it to be equated with gold in the imagination. But to enable it to render its owner the service of a universal equivalent, it must be actually replaced by gold. If the owner of the iron were to go to the owner of some other earthly commodity and were to refer him to the price of iron as proof that it was already money, his answer would be the terrestrial equivalent of the answer given by St. Peter in heaven to Dante when the later recited the Creed. Let's just read the translation for this one. Right will hath now been tested this coin's alloy and weight, but tell me if thou hast it in thy purse. So yeah, you can't, even if you have something that may be worth so much, you have to exchange it to money first. Like, this copy of Capital may be worth $15, but I can't go to the grocery store and exchange it for, apples and bananas or whatever it may be I'm looking for. Price form therefore implies both the exchangeability of commodities for money and the necessity of exchanges. On the other hand, gold serves as an ideal measure of value only because it has already established itself as the money commodity in the process of exchange. Hard cash lurks within the ideal measure of value. So yeah, you have that necessity of the possibility of transforming it into this exchangeable medium to get something. Yeah, we're not in a barter economy, and so you're not actually going to be taking your things to be bartered. All right. So that's the first section, and it's been a pretty dense section. But I think as best I can, I have managed to go through it or explain it as we can. There are some of the more sort of difficult separations here in the section, but I think the most important thing to take out of this section is that there is this sort of evolution to the price form, which kind of indirectly represents or is tied to value in some way that is tied to socially necessary labor time. But that's operating within a market in which socially necessary labor time is constantly changing, and it allows for price to be something separate and apart from that socially necessary labor time. We're not actually trading in labor time values or anything. We're trading in prices, and the market is trading in prices. Those who study or focus on the market are focused on the manipulation and transformation of prices, but underlying this price form was ultimately this sort of socially necessary labor that goes into certain key commodities that measures it in one form or another. So we've kind of talked about in the previous chapters these sort of separations that emerge. You're dealing with like concrete human activity to transform nature, to make something real, to have something come out of it, and this is then sort of separated from that because we're going to the market, we're getting commodities, we're using them in a way that's completely divided or separate from that actual human labor that went into it. We're not experiencing it or even understanding it. And so we have these objects that are speaking for us with other objects within this marketplace, and the human aspect underlying them is lost. Now we're talking about like these sort of further separations that build on top of that, where we have this separation from these objects already separated from us and from our activity, but then separated from these objects is this price form, and then this price form is then separated in a way that allows it to escape temporarily or escape over certain periods of time the demands that socially necessary labor time places on it. So you can have a price that arrives at something different from it. And that is foundational to the functioning of the capitalist mode of production because, for a inefficient business to go out of business, it's producing things at a less valuable way. It's not as efficiently using socially necessary labor time compared to its competitors. So its price is being brought to something that isn't allowing it to be efficiently sold. Like it's being forced to sell at a price that is not an effective return on capital. And so that's going to drive that inefficient business to eventually close, to be driven out of business. And it's going to allow the more efficient ones to conquer the marketplace or in one way or another. And for all of that to happen, you need this separation to have taken place. You need price to be something that is apart from the actual labor value going into things. And that is what allows the capitalist mode of production to then have certain industries be more efficient and, you know, conquer space and drive out the old ones. That's something that begins to allow, you know, these cyclical processes that will push forward the productivity of labor, and that will draw in more and more in the world, and that do so in a manner that eventually places a price on everything. But the fact that the price is placed on something like conscience or honor or even uncultivated land, the fact that those adopt a price, they've sort of like, they've been drawn into the storm, they've been drawn into the hurricane, but the fundamental forces driving that storm are there in this relationship with labor and in this relationship of the commodity driving out of it. These other elements are sort of sucked in and forced to orbit around the center of gravity that is kind of defined in the production process, in the production of commodities that Marx is talking about. And with this price form that emerges out of the production of commodities and the exchange of commodities, with that price form, it then encompasses all of these aspects, which seem like something that is completely apart. And again, this is Marx in advance is something that you know, he's disarming most of the right-wing opponents of Marx that you run into before they even get there, because, you know, what is the bad right wing, you know, some right wing economist comes along and it's like, oh, well, you know, okay, so if it's all socially necessary labor time, then this guy digging with a spoon is just equivalent to some other guy digging with, you know, an excavator or whatever it may be, which obviously that's not how Marx is building up the system or understanding it. And in fact, here we have the seeds of the explanation of why the society goes towards more productive forms of the use of labor, because there is this divergence between price and labor. And then this divergence between price and labor will allow certain sectors with more efficient production, with more efficient use of labor, with more efficient use of investment to capture more of that sort of value there within the socially necessary labor that is going into things, and they'll be able to capture more value, and so there will be the emergence of competition. There will be competition for you know, to raise the productive forces of labor. There will be competition in some cases to do things in ways that don't raise the productive forces of labor and maybe are more short-term needs or demands of capital as well. But yeah, basically we're talking about, Marx has been building up to this point with this previous separation between our labor, between our activity and the objects. Now there's this separation from the objects and their price, and this separation is then fundamental to how we're going to have markets working in a way that'll be as they work under capitalism. But we always must understand that while you may be able to put a price on your honor, your conscience, or your artistic insight, whatever it may be, they are things that have been kind of enveloped and pulled into this storm, into this hurricane. And that the center, the driving force, what's producing the winds, what's producing the pressure, what's pulling it all in, is labor, and is a system built around producing things that we're going to use, that we need to live, that we need to survive, that we need to explore our desires, and that we're forced to do so through you know, interaction with their form and exchange value, and that separation from exchange value and use value. And that is kind of the driving element behind it, which is then able to suck in all of these other elements and force these other elements to then take on and adapt themselves as prices in their own way. So yeah, that is the first section of chapter 3. So we're going to call it here for tonight because my voice is already getting a bit hoarse. And there is quite a lot more of this chapter to go through. It's one of the longer chapters. And it is dense, it is difficult, but I think we are getting there, and I hope that my insights, as best I'm able to marshal them, kind of help to explain it, or help to make it accessible, especially some of these last paragraphs. We were dealing with some difficult formulations. So it's important to take a step back, and also, especially dealing with texts as difficult and dense as this, like don't be afraid to get things wrong as well. Like there will be getting things wrong in the process of trying to understand them. There's a reason it took Marx so long to write this book and to formulate all of these ideas. And ultimately, he didn't finish it all before he died, even. It was Engels finishing and editing volumes 2 and 3, and that wasn't even, the entirety of the full plan that there once was. But yes, sweet, you always get things wrong, getting things wrong now, and I'm getting things wrong right now, I'm sure. But we are as best we can, looking how we can break apart these categories, how we can, understand the elements underlying the capitalist mode of production. And this requires, like, this is why Marx has had to step back so much in abstraction in these first few chapters, because this division, it's precisely to explain what right-wing idiots immediately toss against Marx, which is the division. Why is there a difference between socially necessary labor time and price? And they're like, well, there's a difference between the labor that goes into us and the price on the market. So obviously Marx is wrong. No, Marx has built this entire structure to explain precisely why that comes into being, on the basis of labor being this driven value. Almost no one who criticizes Marx actually sits down and reads him and goes through the work of, like, understanding how this process is built up. And it is difficult. It involves abstraction. It involves taking a step back. It's something necessary. So thanks everyone for joining me tonight. And I think we're going to call it here for now.